Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for Part 2 of the Winning Grant series, through which Dr. Taxman and Dr. Murphy are providing guidance on successful proposal writing for grants administered by the Bureau of Justice Assistance. My name is Keisha Dupree, and I am a Program Associate at the Council of State Governments Justice Center, where we provide training and technical assistance to all grantees funded under the Federal Second Chance Act. Before we begin, I have a couple of technical notes. If you encounter connection or audio problems during this webinar, please call WebEx Technical Support at 1-866-229-3239. I have also placed this number in the chat box on your screen. We may have time for questions and answers from the audience at the end of the webinar. To ask a question, please enter it in the Q&A panel on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. You can ask questions at any point during the webinar, and we will do our best to answer as many as possible before we end at 4 p.m. Eastern Time today. Lastly, this presentation is being recorded and will be archived on our website along with the PDF download of the presentation at nationalreentryresourcecenter.org. You can also find the URL in the chat box. I'll now turn it over to DeAnna Hoskins, Senior Policy Advisor at the Bureau of Justice Assistance, to tell you about the open solicitations and introduce today's speakers.
And welcome to the Winning Webinar series. My name is DeAnna Hoskins. I'm the Senior Policy Advisor for the Department of Justice, overseeing the Second Chance Act portfolio. We currently have 2 grant announcements open that are due May 1st. The Innovations and Supervision Initiative, Building Capacities to Create Safer Communities, and the Second Chance Act Comprehensive Community-Based Adult Reentry Program. The links are above, and you also can find them on the National Reentry Resource website as well. We will be having a webinar tomorrow at 3 p.m. responding to the Innovations and Supervision Initiative webinar that give you actual strategies and requirements for that solicitation to apply. I now would like to turn it over to Dr. Faye Taxman and Dr. Amy Murray to conduct the Winning webinar. Thank you.
Dr. Taxman and Dr. Murphy, you may be muted. I'm not able to get any sound.
Sorry about that.
No problem.
So thank you, Keisha and DeAnna, and welcome back to everyone. And so today we're going to continue going over some of the features of winning grants for especially those directed at BJA. And I'll go through this slide fairly quickly because it's largely a review of what we went over on Thursday. So you want a clear problem. Why are you concerned about the problem at hand, and what have you tried? So this is where you really want to use data to assert the problem at hand. Be as specific as possible. Discuss what you've tried and what has or has not been effective. You need clear aims. What are you trying to accomplish? So just saying I want to reduce recidivism is not going to cut it. Again, you really want to be very specific about what you're trying to accomplish here. Clear design. How is your approach going to achieve the desired outcome? So you really want to show how the intervention that you've identified addresses the problem that you've discussed. Clear steps. How are you going to put the plan into action? So what does the implementation of the actual program look like? Clear feasibility. Can the agency do this initiative? You need to be realistic about your agency's capacity. Provide examples that show you've implemented other innovations successfully. You need clear measures. How do you know when you are making progress? You want to be able to articulate what data you're going to be collecting and how you will use the data to inform the project. And then finally, partners. It takes a village. So you really want to look at who you're going to be working with on this grant, including other agencies, other organizations, and especially you may want to engage a research partner to work with you on the project. So on Thursday, we covered the background of the problem and the project design. This webinar will be available through the Justice Center's website if you weren't able to join us. And today we're going to review some of the implementation, capabilities, and competencies, the plan for collecting data required for the solicitation, and everyone's favorite, the budget. But first I want to do a refresher on some of what we talked about on Thursday for those of you who weren't able to join us. The background of the problem is going to represent about 15% of the proposal's value, and you only have about 4 pages to establish it. So during Thursday's webinar, we shared an example from Hidalgo, Texas, where they clearly outline, using data, the problem of high recidivism rates among young adults in their jurisdiction. They also discussed what we know about the development of impulse control and regulating emotions among young adults. And they then related the identified problem to the proposed intervention. So what we saw there was a good example of a clear problem. Why are you concerned about the problem at hand, and what have you tried? Clear aims. What are you trying to accomplish? Significance. How will this initiative improve outcomes such as recidivism? And then we want to get into the design of your project. And this is really the meat of the proposal. This is where you have the opportunity to score the most points. So it's going to represent about 40% of the value, and you have around 10 pages to establish it. So what you need here are to establish what you're trying to accomplish, how is your approach going to achieve the desired outcome, how you're going to put your plan into action. So you want to demonstrate that you've identified an innovative or effective approach to address the problem at hand. Talk about what you are trying to accomplish. So Hidalgo County wanted to reduce recidivism among emerging adults, and their approach was to design and implement an intervention that targets those young adults. And then when it comes to clear steps, you really want to be as accurate and clear as possible about who is going to do what and when. And so this slide is to show you what the pillars of the project design are going to look like. So first, you really want to identify what your target population is, and then you want to identify how you're going to develop and implement an intervention that helps that target population. So some of the core features are going to be assessment. How do you decide what the person needs? Are they appropriate for the proposed intervention? Evidence-informed or evidence-based practices. So what is it? What is the intervention that you're planning on? You want to use sources like crimesolutions.gov to determine and to find an appropriate evidence-based intervention. Length of time and dosage. You also want to be paying attention to how much time, how many hours of programming is the client intended to get. You also want to be thinking about what the intensity of that programming is going to be. Is it going to be front-loaded, for example, where someone gets a number of hours of programming in the early weeks of the program and then tapers down as they begin to be better at managing some of their issues. Non-compliance management. You need to think ahead about what sort of responses are you going to have when individuals are not complying with the conditions of the program. So for example, it would not be sufficient to simply kick everyone out when they don't comply. You want to think about having different incentives and sanctions in place in order to really motivate people to ensure they comply with the program. And you want to think about the continuum of care. How does this program fit into a continuum of care? For example, are the individuals going to be receiving aftercare? And how does it fit with their general probation or other supervision that they may be under? The second major piece you want to think about is staffing. So who is going to take the lead in terms of the project? You'll want to make sure that you have somebody with strong leadership experience who is interested and enthusiastic about the project. You also want to think about how you're going to train staff. Is it going to be a one-shot thing, or are you going to include things like coaching and fidelity measures, et cetera? And then you also want to think about your relationships with other treatment or criminal justice agencies. So how do you plan to work with these other agencies? Are you going to have MOUs and or contracts in place? And if so, what are those contracts or MOUs going to stipulate? And then, of course, making sure that you're thinking about the HIPAA regulations as well as CFR.
Thank you, Amy. We're now going to get into the next, the content for today's webinar, which is basically looking at capabilities and competencies. So this is 30% of the grant proposal. That's an important thing to know because, again, you're writing in order to score points so that you could actually, be considered for funding for your particular initiative. So what does competencies and capabilities mean? So the first part is to define who is the applicant organization, and that's really critical because oftentimes there might be a number of organizations that you're working with on your particular design, both in the supervision and the reentry efforts. These are collaborative interagency efforts, and so it's useful to really have a good sense of who is the applicant organization. Now, there are requirements in both of those grants for who that application should come from. But there are also requirements that you document that you have partnerships available to support the grant and that you have letters of support or memorandums of understanding. In defining your capacity to actually do the work that you're laying out there, you also might want to talk about the innovations and organizational development that your agency has implemented over the last 5 years. These are really critical areas because this basically helps the reader know that your organization is capable of making the changes that's being proposed. And that's important because they really want to know, can you get the funding, get the project in place? These are 3-year grants, so there's a short window of time to actually build and implement. And so, your job as a grant writer is to really prove that your agency has that capacity. And then third, another issue about capacity is whether or not this project ties into your existing goals and missions. You want to make sure that the project is consistent with your overall mission for your organization and the direction that you're actually going. So how do you prove your capacity? Well, one of it is to basically demonstrate your competence, and the other part is to actually demonstrate that you know how to put in place a project. So organizational structure and timeline are the keys to success here. They're really useful to be able to guide how you're actually going to put this particular project into place. Okay, so organizational structure. It's really important to define who's going to lead this particular project, not just who the administrator or chief of a particular organization is, but who's actually going to direct the project. And as we've indicated here, there are a number of people that might be involved. One set of people may have to do with the key staff, and it's important here to indicate who the key staff are, what they will do, and who will make sure that they're actually doing it. So you need some sort of management or supervision function there. As you will note, in the appendices, you need to put in you need to put in descriptions for particular positions. So if you don't have existing staff in a particular area, you can actually just propose that you're going to add a position like a clinical supervisor or a mentor or a coach. Those are just examples. Of course, your individual projects, you'll have your own sort of staffing that you'll want to pursue here. But it's important to describe what the person will do, and you have an appendices devoted to sort of more detail about that particular position. Another area that's very important in these grants is to talk about quality assurance. How will you know that you're actually putting in place?
One moment, let me find out who that is.
Oh, my. Well, we all wanted a little music today.
It seems as though someone has put us on hold, so let me figure this out. Oh, all right, we're good to go. Sorry about that.
That's all right. All right, so as I was talking about quality assurance, you really want to be able to document in your organizational structure what you're going to measure for fidelity, how you're going to know that the grant is proceeding as you desired and the program is functioning. And to do that, you want to indicate what type of quality assurance. Similarly, for some of the grants, you may want to indicate an evaluator, a partner that's going to help you measure, you know, essentially how well your project is doing, and also give you some feedback on different types of data so that you can make improvements in the project. And then another part of the organizational structure are your partners, your reentry councils, your memorandum of agreements with other parties that you could actually use to really make substantive, you know, partnerships to really help deliver the particular project that you're putting in place. So your organizational structure, which, you know, this graph here lays out what are the components that you should discuss. This is basically about a page of your proposal, maybe a page and a half, but it's really an opportunity for you to identify how you're going to make sure each piece of the proposal works as you had planned, and then you really want to do more in terms of helping people understand what the roles are that people will play. All right. So, as we've indicated before, in this particular section, you need to talk about staffing and leadership. As we said before, you know, a chief of an organization or a director of an agency are important, but it's really about who's going to run this particular grant. So you need to identify what unit's responsible for the project, who's got the daily oversight, how this relates to design. And next, you need to focus your attention on staff development issues, training. In other words, how will staff be trained to put the design in place? As I indicated before, quality assurance and fidelity management are critical aspects, as well as your partnerships with other organizations. Can't overlook the importance of really proving to the reader that you know how to run these initiatives and that you're going to be able to really do a good job in terms of making sure everything's in place. So we have an example from a currently funded project, the HOPE Network, which is a workforce development network. And you can see here how this particular grantee discussed what they were going to do. They basically indicated how they were going to screen, recruit, supervise, and support a volunteer system of networks. Now, a volunteer system of mentors. Now, we all know that working with volunteers is rewarding, but it's also challenging because, you know, volunteers have to know what they're being asked to do, but there's a lot of issues that organizations have with volunteers in terms of making sure that people are responsible, that the duties get fulfilled. So you can see here where they did a very detailed description of how they're going to ensure that the volunteer mentors applications indicate what the person's prior justice experience was, and also their ability to demonstrate that they've been successful without any major challenges. Then they talk about the pre-service academy that they're going to put the volunteers through. That includes 6 hours of training, and they detail for you with the training. And then they also talk about how they're going to match a mentor with a mentee. All of this detail, all in one paragraph, so, my page limits are fairly doable here. They're just hints given the, 15-page application size that BJA has provided. But you can see here the level of detail that's required and the way in which they've, crafted this to kind of tell you the story, and you're very convinced that they understand this organization, how to manage volunteers and how to work with volunteers. Another important aspect, and this goes in one of the appendices, is to actually include a timeline. Now, a timeline is really critical because the timeline demonstrates that you know how to put a project into place. So the timeline, I like to think of them as action plans. They're telling you who, what, where, when is something going to be done. They also identify what types of deliverables you're going to be able to produce for BJA, and also give a sense of how the project is going to flow. So a timeline, to me, is more than just a list of what month something's going to occur. It's really telling a story about how your particular project is going to get done. Here's an example of a timeline from a grantee. It's the one that Amy mentioned before, where she indicated what the grantee, was going to basically do. So this one basically sets out to identify what type of implementation effort, who's going to lead that effort, what type of training is going to occur, who's going to lead that effort, and in what month. And you can see by just these two tasks here, implementation and training, that they sort of told a story that they're going to do some early implementation before they actually work on training staff in this particular initiative. Okay. So another requirement of the grants are to basically collect data that's required for the solicitation. And in this particular grant application, this is about 5% of the value of your grant. There's also a reporting system that BJA maintains that you will have to put in data on a frequent basis. Now, as we discussed last week, an important part is figuring out what type of data that you will report on. And we've identified here both a manual that BJA funded that looks at process measures, but also this manual gives you different ways of calculation of different core measures that can tell the story about your efforts. Now, given a 3-year window for your demonstration project, BJA would like you to keep information on outcomes like recidivism, technical violations, employment, and those are really critical. But what's also critical is that you keep process measures And these are very well detailed in this particular publication that's available on the website of the Council for State Government. So to go into a little bit more detail, here are 4 types of measures. Descriptives, those usually refer to the demographics of the population, target population that your project is working through. It could also include the demographics of the staff that are involved in this particular initiative. Another set of measures has to do with the activities that are part of your project design. And those activities can actually be, council meetings or interagency meetings, participation levels of the clients, whether it's in screening and assessment, referral to other organizations, and then working really towards activities that basically break out your particular design. Now, all of BJA activity grants will have an initial stage in which you'll be able to identify the steps of your particular project, but also the activities that are involved. And this will give you some good ideas about how you could actually measure what sort of processes you want to use. As I've indicated before, I'm a big fan of thinking about process measures like people showing up for meetings. We know if people show up, that's half the battle. And so, be creative here and think about some of the different types of processes that you could actually measure. It's also the case that these process measures could be very useful in making adjustments in your projects so that they better define the types of the types of activities and also how well you're doing in terms of implementing your project. For example, sometimes it takes a while for clients to begin to use different services, and by being able to monitor the activities that you actually do, it'd be really useful to be able to document them by looking at initiation rates or participation rates or retention rates in particular services. A third set of measures to consider have to do with implementation, and these are typically at the organizational level. So here the question is what is the opinions and perspectives of staff? And that's important because you want to know to what degree is the staff supporting your particular initiative or this new innovation that you're trying to put in place. Another measure has to do with fidelity or adherence to your project design. As we discussed before with staffing, measuring quality assurance is critically important. And another component has to do with systems or system features in terms of support services you're getting from other organizations like the police department or from a treatment provider. But implementation measures are critically important because they let us know how well this particular initiative is fitting within the system of services and whether or not you're able to do the project that you've actually requested to be funded from BJA. Another source are outcomes, and outcomes here have to do with typically longer term, what we call distal outcomes or events that occur farther away from when someone begins a project, and those may have to do with recidivism, technical violations, recovery management efforts. All of these are really designed to be able to basically tell the story of whether or not you've been able, through this project, to have an impact on what happens to clients and they're recycling through the justice system. So an important effort here is the data that you're going to use. And as part of this section, I always advise people to really focus in on what sort of administrative or computer-based data sources do you have available to you. So a number of reentry and probation agencies have assessment tools that they use, or they have case management tools. It would be good to describe what those systems are. You also should describe what are the key components. You know, does the system have all of the different types of, you know, elements in the assessment instrument? For example, if you're using the LSIR or ORAS or any of those assessment tools, Compass, you know, do you have all of those items or do you just have a total score? And it's important to know what is actually available. The other piece is to also here describe prior work with that management information system. Like this could be very useful to convince people, part of the capability section, that you actually know how to use this data and that you can actually be very successful in the use of this data. Next, we want to, it's important for you to define how to measure recidivism. This is actually a requirement within the grant proposal. And it's part of what BJA wants to make sure is that each organization can measure recidivism. Not only do you have the data, but you have access to it and you have a standard way of measuring recidivism. How long you're going to look at recidivism, whether it's 6 months, 12 months, 24 months, 36 months, that will be up to you. But essentially here you want to prove to the reader that you can measure recidivism either using rearrest, reconviction, reincarceration for any offense or for certain offenses, violent offenses, felony offenses. That's up to you, but all those definitions need to be included. If you have a research partner, you may have some original data that you will collect, either through focus groups, interviews with people, surveys. So all of those focus groups, interviews, or surveys actually need to be specified in the data section, and that will be really critically important because you can then talk about why you're doing that specific data collection and what you're going to get out of those particular efforts that you wouldn't get out of a management information system. And finally, an important part of this particular section is to identify who's going to handle the data and if you need memorandums of agreement or you need specificity in terms of any types of ways of linking the data, you should actually describe that in this part of the proposal. The data section may not be a lot of points, 5%, but it's a good way of helping to convince the reader that, you know, you're well schooled in using data and using data as a way to guide some of the program level decisions. Okay, so we actually have a sample here from the Pennsylvania Board of Probation and Parole. And this one has to do with the ability to measure performance measures that they specified in their proposal. So they talk about how they're going to collect and report the performance metrics. And, you know, they identified here that they will collect assessments that are part of the inmate parolee file system. They will use the reporting office's database. And they have a specific way to measure effectiveness in terms of adherence to program interventions. And then they go on to really talk about other types of measures that they are able to gather from this particular database, including absconding behavior, employment, recidivism, and payment of fees. So they, again, packed into this one little paragraph, a lot of details that give you the sense that they really know what's in the data and they know how they're actually going to use the data. They also talk about some additional data that they want to collect. So here they've identified data from inmates that are under the, being under the supervision of DOC, and they talk about how they will use the Statistical Analysis Center, and then they will, upon parole release, they'll use treatment data that they can get from other organizations. So they're very clear here in terms of what types of data sources they're going to have and how that's going to be used. Again, they've been able to pack this into some short paragraphs here.
So the next piece of the grant is going to be the budget, and that's going to account for 10% of the value of your project. And of course, the most important piece of advice is to stay within the solicitation budget, and that's going to include not only the work that you're doing, but any subcontractors that you're working with, including your research partner. A couple of things that you want to keep in consideration when you're developing your budget is you'll need to complete the budget detail worksheet provided by BJA. You're going to include one annual travel to a DOJ-sponsored meeting. You want to, of course, make sure that the budget is complete. Have you established all of the important pieces, thinking about staffing, thinking about space, thinking about all of the different things that go into your budget. Another thing you want to do is make sure that all of the expenses are allowable. So, for example, maybe you're in a very rural area and you think it would be useful to have a bus that would be able to pick people up and take them to meetings. But if that's not allowable within the RFP, you need to make sure that you're finding a different way to cover that expense. You want to have a very thorough budget narrative. You want to make sure that it's going to describe the role of all of the different staff that are being requested. So whether these are staff who are already part of your organization or staff who you plan to hire, you want to make sure you describe who they are, what percentage of effort they're going to be putting into this, and what the total amount is going to be. Don't forget about the fringe benefit rates. So obviously those crucial things like health insurance. Take into consideration any kind of travel expenses. So for example, going to the DOJ-sponsored meeting. Think about any consultants that you may be wanting to work with. So for example, maybe if you wanted to build a website for your program, you want to think about hiring out someone for that expense. And then of course you want to take into consideration any other direct expenses, such as maybe providing subsidies for individuals to get to and from the program. A couple additional things to think about, or RFP nuisances, as we have labeled them. So think about what risk need assessment tool are you going to be using? This is something that's really crucial in order to ensure that you are providing the best type of care for an individual. So you want to be able to think about what is the individual's level of risk? Are they high, low, moderate risk? As well as what needs they have. So think about, you want to make sure that you're using a validated risk and need tool. Think about, whether people are going to need to be trained on using that tool, or if it's already something that the agency has been using for an extensive period of time. Think about evidence-based supervision or treatments that you're going to be using. So when you're proposing any kind of intervention, you want to be able to refer back to a source like crimesolutions.gov to ensure that the proposed intervention is something that is evidence-based or evidence-informed. You want to think about the supervision requirements. So this may be about providing a specific intervention for your clients, for the individuals under supervision, but we also still need to take into consideration that all of the other things they're required to do don't go away just because they're involved in a special program. So think about how frequently do they need to report to court and or to their probation or parole officer, and make sure that it's realistic. Thinking about partnerships, who are going to be your different partners in developing this program. So, of course, we always emphasize the research partner. So think about if it's a research partner that you've worked with over time and you've had successful partnerships with, even if the research partner is new to you, you can think about what other projects they've worked on, ask them for information on other studies that they've been involved in, other correctional type programs that they've provided research assistance to. You want to think about involvement in agency efforts. So you can't do this by yourself. This is something where you're going to want both the commitment of your whole agency, but also of other agencies that are doing similar work. So whether it's a neighboring probation department or a community-based treatment provider, you want to think about those different partnerships. And you want to think about why you're seeking federal assistance. So this is something that's really crucially important because you need to think about sustainability. So what is this innovation that you aren't able to implement with your current resources, and how can federal assistance be of help to you? And then think about how you can also continue to sustain that once the federal assistance has gone. And of course, you need to read very carefully the RFP to really outline what needs to be included. And I would recommend that be one of your very first steps in developing this. So making sure that everyone who's working on the proposal has read the RFP, and that you use that RFP to develop an outline of what needs to be included. So all of the basic things that we've talked about, but in addition to that, you know, the RFP may have certain other specifications that we haven't gone over here. So you want to be thinking about that throughout the process. You want to look at the RFP for any priority considerations. So what we found that in the innovations in supervision, one thing that they're very focused on this year are strategies to reduce violent recidivism. And in order to really work on that issue, you need to think about how the group that you're targeting is going to be identified. So what kind of strategies are you going to use to reduce violent recidivism? Who is the target population? You're going to want to demonstrate your access to and use of data and law enforcement input. So you can't reduce violent recidivism on your own. This is something where you're going to need to develop partnerships with local law enforcement, and you may want to think about developing different MOUs with them in terms of being able to share data across systems. For the reentry grants, they have identified a few things, a few priority considerations. So targeting high-risk individuals with violent offense convictions. So with that, what you may want to demonstrate in your program narrative is that you're going to use a risk and need assessment tool that's going to help you identify who those individuals are who are high risk. And then you'll want to be able to use people's rap sheets to determine whether or not they've had any history of violence, and that'll help you identify who is appropriate for your target population. There's a strong emphasis on using randomized controlled trials in the reentry grant and ensuring that there's a plan for an independent evaluation. So once again, we can't emphasize this enough, engaging a research partner because they will be really key in working with you when you're trying to develop a randomization plan and a plan for independent evaluation. Another key consideration is for reentry grants is that they're interested in involving crime victims and their families, law enforcement, individuals who have been incarcerated, and the families of individuals who have been incarcerated. So oftentimes these projects focus solely on the individual who is returning to the community from incarceration, but we want to be able to think about the broader spectrum of people who are impacted by reentry, by a person's incarceration. And so that would include any of the individual's victims, the victims' families and their support systems, thinking about your law enforcement partners, and then also thinking about the families of those individuals who have been incarcerated, and what's going to be in place in terms of family reunification. Another thing that BJA is very interested in seeing for these reentry grants is working with your local reentry council or task force. So that's something you want to put as a top priority, is to engage with your local reentry council and perhaps get a letter of support from them. And then if you're particularly interested in applying for Category 2 for the reentry grants, that is specifically interested in serving rural populations, and you can refer to BJA to determine what the specific definition of the rural population is going to be. And so finally, some of the really basic requirements of what's covered in a grant proposal. So for all of these items that we've discussed, the project design, the statement of the problem, the plan for collecting data, for collecting data, you've only got 15 pages for that. So you really need to be parsimonious about what goes into your grant, and you're going to want to have some strong editing and have a number of people looking over and making sure that you're only including the most important pieces of information. One little nitpicky thing that you need to remember is you need to follow the guidelines that are provided in the RFP. So you want 12-point font. Your grant should be double-spaced, and at the bottom of each page, it should read page 1 of 15, page 2 of 15, etc. And one thing that you want to think about here, too, is even though you only have 15 pages, you also have appendices, and those are really an opportunity for you to shine. This is where you can really provide more information that you weren't able to fit into those original 15 pages. So thinking about samples of your prior work product, thinking about some prior projects, funded projects that you've done that have been successful that you'd like to highlight, thinking about showing more about the staff who are going to be working on the project, describing an organizational chart, describing the different expertise that all of the different individuals that you're working with are going to bring to the project. So in addition to being creative with the appendices, you also want to make sure that you're being very careful to include all of the appendices that are outlined in the RFP and that are required. So for innovations in supervision, that's going to include the timeline that we discussed, where you really identify what is going to happen, when is it going to happen, who is going to be responsible for this, and what are the benchmarks where we can tell if this has been happening, if this has been successful. You're going to require a letter from your community supervision agency executive, and that's going to need to establish that the agency is committed to the project and to the recommended research partnership. You'll need a letter from the lead agency if the supervision agency is not the lead agency, and that's, again, going to want to demonstrate commitment to the project and to the research partnership. you'll want a letter from your research partner if you have engaged a research partner, and hopefully we have convinced you by now that you definitely need to do that. And so that letter would establish what the research partner plans to bring to the project and what kind of expertise they have on this topic. And of course, you'll want letters of support from all of your other key partners. So if you are working in concert with some additional agencies, with behavioral health, with treatment agencies, you'll want to get letters of support from them as well. You need to include the assurance to collect and submit recidivism indicator data, position descriptions for all the key roles of individuals who are going to be working on the project. You need to provide resumes and or CVs for the key personnel on the project, so the people who are going to be the leadership of the project and people who are going to have the key roles. Another thing that you may want to include are examples of your prior work products, and some of these could include reports, websites that you have built, any policy briefs that you've done, publications that you may have produced, and finally the applicant disclosure of pending applications. So if, for example, you're applying for innovations in supervision and also for SWIFT Cert and FAIR, you would want to make sure that you disclose all of that. And then similarly, there's a laundry list of requirements for the appendices for those applying for the innovations in reentry. And so that's going to include a memorandum of understanding with your correctional partners. So the applicant for reentry is going to need to be typically a community-based treatment provider, but they're going to want to make sure that they engage with their correctional partners, such as probation or parole. Also an MOA or MOU with local law enforcement, explaining what their role is going to be and what they'll be providing. Once again, a timeline or project plan that outlines goals, activities, person responsible, and the expected dates. Descriptions of the different positions that are part of the grant, especially those key personnel. Again, you'll want letters of support from any key partners in which they really want to describe what they bring to the project and really describe that they're committed to working on the project and promoting the mission of the project. You'll want a letter from your research partner again, and again, and applicant disclosure of pending applications, as well as a statement of research and evaluation independence and integrity. And that's going to really just establish that you know how to comply with BJA's standards for research and evaluation, independence, and integrity. And so with that, are there any questions for us?
Hi, so we do have a few questions. The first one is around a clarification of page limits. It was mentioned that 15 pages was the maximum. However, a few questions have come around. The community-based reentry RFP states that there is a 20-page maximum, so just wanted to know if that has changed or if they're different for each solicitation and people should just follow whatever the solicitation says for that specific proposal.
Definitely look at your specific solicitation that you're going after and follow what is in there.
Awesome. Question 2, around allowable incentives. Client stipends and gift cards aren't allowable. Can you provide examples of allowable incentives that they'd be able to utilize?
So you can use incentives as long as you are not using federal funds. So if your particular organization has a foundation or it has business partners, you can talk about the incentives, but you just need to make it very clear that the incentives will be provided from non-federal funds. The types of incentives that you can use, however, might include, for example, if people are on supervision and you can change their drug testing schedule or change the frequency that they report or alter the amount of fees that are paid. Those are not using federal funds. They're just showing how the program can actually, deliver incentives in a way that's creative and consistent with the project goal.
Thank you. Another question says, when an RFP lists a program evaluator or research partner as optional, will applications with research partners always be stronger?
Well, I think as we mentioned on the webinar last Thursday, we are strong believers in the action research model with a research partner. BJA for many years has basically promoted the use of research practitioner partnerships as a good way of growing organizational development, sustaining efforts, and developing data that can be used not only for this grant but throughout the organization. We encourage partnerships because you are actually growing your capacity. Similar to the purpose of a reentry council or the purpose of having MOUs with other types of partners, law enforcement, correctional agencies, treatment providers. Having a partnership with a research organization enhances your problem analysis, enhances a utilization of evidence-based treatments and practices, as well as helps you be able to monitor how well you're doing in implementing your program. And as we mentioned last time, the research literature has basically found that a presence of a researcher facilitates implementation. Mark Lipsey with Vanderbilt University, in a number of studies that he's done looking at effective components, he's basically identified that having a research partner available and part of the team really enhances quality implementation as well as getting to reductions in recidivism.
Thank you. Another question, are research partners an integral part of the DOJ-sponsored meeting, and should they be written into the budget for travel as well?
So, DeAnna, do you have some guidance on whether or not people should include in their budget travel for their research partner?
I believe DeAnna has left us as we are still on hold there. So if whomever asked that question, if you don't mind, you can email me. And my information is attached to this webinar, and I can reach out to DeAnna and then give you an answer on that. So let's continue. There's another question here about the relevance of letters of support. One of the attendees was recently at a conference, and it was stated that letters of support were of no value and that they should rather focus on MOAs or letters of commitment, and just wanting to know if that's the case with BJA.
Well, in a letter of support, a good letter of support not only talks about, that a particular organization is innovative or provides a valuable service to the community, but a good part of a letter of support is to indicate how that organization that's providing the letter will work with the grantee. So I would look at a letter of support as not just basically, something that, promotes a particular organization. I would look at it as a letter of support as something that indicates how people are going to work together. It's a precursor to MOAs or MOUs. But, having read grant proposals for 30-some-odd years, I think letters of support actually demonstrate the ability of an organization to work with other partners and to include people in the problem-solving component.
Wonderful, thank you. This will be our last question as we're coming up on 4. It says, if your evaluation or research department is internal to the applying agency, what recommendations would you give to show your impartiality in the application?
Well, as part of, you know, I think you could indicate that the research partner is internal and, you know, that they have worked with your organization for a long time, and maybe give an example in which they've been able to basically talk about, as I would say, the good, bad, and ugly that often occurs. I mean, you just want to basically demonstrate that this research partner, internal partner, is, you know, objective and works across, you know, the organization. You can also show reports that they've done as part of some of your background documentation. You know, so these are various ways in which you can demonstrate the impact of your organization.
Great, thank you. Thank you everyone for attending. Before we close, I'd just like to thank Dr. Taxman, Dr. Murphy, and DeAnna Hoskins for today's webinar discussion. And just a reminder to everyone that today's presentation was recorded and will be available on our website at nationalreentryresourcecenter.org within the next few days. And again, that link is also in the chat box. So thank you. This concludes today's webinar, and everyone have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.